Fraser is a very hard act to follow, I'm sure. But I shall do my best. As a young person, I'd never thought, as I do now, that I'd be ashamed to be an Australian. One of the main reasons for that shame, but not the only ones, are our policies to asylum seekers and Aboriginal people. Both issues, I might mention, directly affected me in my former role as Chief Justice of the Family Court. But today I'll be discussing asylum seekers. It'll be recalled that it was the Labor government in 1992 that first acted to provide for mandatory detention of asylum seekers and set up a detention facility at Port Hedland, where we began the appalling process of detaining asylum seekers and their children. At the time it was first introduced, the policy of holding asylum seekers in detention and doing so in remote areas like Port Hedland, I accepted an invitation to speak at a seminar at the MCG on the rights of children. In 1992, I took the opportunity to criticise the government for setting up what I described as virtual concentration camps in a remote area, and particularly for wrongly detaining children contrary to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. That set up a media hue and cry, with my remarks appearing on the front page of The Australian, which surprisingly, given its present attitudes, agreed with me. They even ran a cartoon of then Immigration Minister Balkis depicted dressed in Nazi uniform outside a concentration camp, and even Greg Sheridan expressed support for my remarks, but things have changed since then. The government response was, of course, predictable, and I was criticised for speaking publicly as a judge on a political issue. I took the view then and now that human rights issues transcend mere political issues and that they give rise to a duty to espouse them. Subsequently, in 2001, a case came before the Family Court involving asylum seeker children, where it was argued that the court in its welfare jurisdiction should order the release from detention of these children in light of evidence as their extreme psychiatric and psychological deterioration, which is common, as you've already heard, in relation to people held in detention, particularly children. The trial judge dismissed the application on the ground that the court lacked jurisdiction. On appeal, the full court over which I presided held that it did have jurisdiction and made an order ordering the minister to release the children. This she did, but successfully appealed to the High Court, which unanimously held that we lacked jurisdiction to make that order. Normally, one might feel chastened by a unanimous defeat by 7 judges in the High Court, but I think I could say that I have never been as proud of any decision I made as a judge as I am of that one. I still think that it was morally and legally correct, even though the court thought otherwise. I think an earlier Mason High Court might well have taken a different view, as it was far more liberal-minded than its successor. And of course, the particular constitution of appellate courts can have a very significant effect on the outcomes of cases that they hear. But a practical result, at least at that time, was that the children were not returned to detention, and revulsion against the practice of detaining children gained some force, to a point where, for a time, both parties adopted the policy but not the practice of refraining from doing so. But that's changed markedly, to the point where only this week the media reported that Gestapo-like tactics of the Department of Immigration in removing mothers and children sent to Australia for medical treatment in the early hours of the morning to Christmas Island. Now that to me is utterly disgraceful, that people should be dragged out in the early hours of the morning without notice and set off to some remote location in that fashion. And of course it's happening in relation to Nauru as well. And I understand that work is now in progress to hold families in Manus. And speaking of such practices as totalitarian practices, the Abbott government has adopted another practice of totalitarian regimes, of shrouding its activities in secrecy and applying a false patina of military necessity. What they are now doing is hidden from the public and the media. Goebbels, Stalin and similar people would have been very proud of them. This indefensible policy continues, fuelled by what I believe to be the immoral attitude of the major parties that Malcolm has already spoken of. The Howard government's policy of turning around votes and reintroducing temporary protection visas was a combination of refined cruelty and criminal disregard for human life. Despite the crocodile tears shed in Parliament by its proponents then and now, as Malcolm has already pointed out. The revival of the so-called Nauru and PNG solutions that both parties continue to support was a pathetic return to morally bereft policy. And let's not forget that it was under the Gillard and Rudd governments that this revival took place. But, of course, it's been enthusiastically supported by the Abbott government and its indescribable Minister for Immigration. His hypocrisy was demonstrated once again when interviewed on PM this morning, when he said that the only Iraqi refugees who'd be returned were those who wished to do so. He failed to mention that the whole policy of his government is to treat themselves abominably, that they'll have no choice but to take such extreme measures. And let's not also forget the Nauru episode from its beginning, which has involved wholesale human rights abuse by Australian governments and supported by the Nauruan government because it really had no choice. And it took steps such as in 2003 banning lawyers, human rights activists, healthcare professionals and independent observers, leading Amnesty International to issue a global alert about the deteriorating human rights situation in Nauru. Since then, the situation has become even worse with the complete breakdown of the rule of law in that country, tacitly encouraged by this government in Australia. The resident magistrate was sacked and deported, and the Chief Justice refused a visa to even enter the country. Now think about that. If the Chief Justice of the High Court was refused a visa to enter Australia, you can imagine the response that we would have to that. And yet this government didn't even raise a voice of criticism. I think it was a pathetic response, which again Morrison relied upon, saying that it was a matter for a sovereign state and that Australia would not intervene. Contrast this with the Australian attitude to similar breakdowns of the rule of law in the Solomons and Fiji. This was just the use of a client state for the Australian government's immoral purposes. And similarly, we saw in PNG an asylum seeker murdered and others seriously injured in front of hundreds of witnesses. No one's been prosecuted. The government is reported to Australian government is supposed to have supported the government of Papua New Guinea in opposing litigation brought against it in relation to those proceedings. So not only is our government pathetic, as Malcolm Fraser has pointed out, so is the opposition, which only yesterday cravenly refused to alter its policies in relation to Nauru and Manus. And it only did so because it wasn't game to take a principled stand, because it might lose some of the redneck votes that it wishes to retain. As for temporary protection visas, they're morally repugnant and designed to act as a deterrent to separating families. Those promoting them should really pay regard to the possibility that boats, such as the SIEVX, were so full of women and children because that was the only chance of them seeking to join their husbands in Australia. In my view, the use of those visas is also an evil policy that has no possible redeeming feature. And as Malcolm has said, it seems that both parties want to appeal to xenophobic views. The calumnies heaped on the Greens in relation to their immigration policy are pure exercises in hypocrisy, because in fact they're the only party with a decent and humane policy towards refugees. I believe that we must continue to oppose the government and opposition policies which, taken together or separately, are the real reason that people find it necessary to expose themselves to the horrible risks associated with travelling by boat. It's also time that we put the problem in proportion. I noted an article by the recently appointed Human Rights Commissioner, not the right-wing one, which noted in a St James Ethics paper that Australia received 15,226 boat arrivals in 2011, compared with Greece's 56,180, Italy's 91,821, and Spain's 74,317. And that outflow of refugees continues to this day in huge numbers into Europe. Yet we don't find people being locked up in cages. We don't find them sent to outlying islands. We don't find them ill-treated in this way. For example, it was also reported in the media yesterday that Germany has agreed to take 40,000 refugees from Syria. Where is Australia? Nowhere. It's more than time that we got rid of the pejorative and inappropriate terms such as queue jumping and border protection and brought some humanity to bear on this issue. These are human beings, and many of them families with children. And we should stop talking nonsense about stopping boats and processing people. How do you process people? And get on with helping them. Well, how did we get ourselves into this state? We are, as Malcolm again has pointed out, rapidly becoming an international pariah, riding roughshod over solemn treaty obligations into which we have entered, like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the UN Refugee Convention and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And it may surprise you to know that successive governments have been able to get away with this legally by never importing those conventions into domestic law. Thus we show an international face as a good international citizen of observing these conventions, but in reality we ignore them and the rights conferred by them at home and on the high seas. This is the height of hypocrisy, which in the past has been justified by saying that as a democracy applying the rule of law, Australia would never act contrary to international law in this way. But for obvious reasons, that can't be said with a straight face anymore. And another reason for our problem is that unlike most major democracies in the world, we've never enacted a Bill of Rights. Most Conservatives have opposed it because it acts as a brake on the power of government to act as they please, and Labor, although it has such a policy, has done nothing about it and has shown a distinct lack of enthusiasm. I think the last Bill of Rights was introduced by Gareth Evans when he was Attorney General, was allowed to lapse with the calling of the next election and hasn't been heard of since. In its absence, we're extremely vulnerable to the abuse of power by our governments, which have and are engaging in abuse, but directing it to a small and unpopular minority of non-citizens that they're able to demonise. But I think we should be very wary about this. Let there be no mistake that legally there's little to stop our government treating citizens like this as well, in the absence of a Bill of Rights. The current behaviour by successive governments to asylum seekers should be a salutary lesson of the dangers lying in pursuing those sorts of policies. What must we then do? And that's the big question. I think that we must work together to show governments that this situation won't continue to be tolerated. It's very much to the credit of this hospital that it's allowed this subject to be discussed publicly, and it's also to the credit of the medical profession of Australia that they're taking an interest in these areas, and people like Dr. Paxton are a shining example of the sort of people that we want paying attention to it. I believe there's a slow beginning of a groundswell in the community of distaste for these policies, and with the leadership of people like Malcolm Fraser, the wheel may turn, but not before much human misery will be suffered by some of the most vulnerable people of all. Perhaps the move against the policies by a minority in the Labor caucus was a small harbinger of change. We must bring it home to people, that the people we're mistreating in this way are people just like us, with the same hopes and aspirations. We must stand up, sadly, to the Abbotts, Morrisons and Shortens of this world. I conclude with a quote from an Australian playwright, Andrew Bavell, who said this, and I thought it was a very interesting statement. He said, "A man burned himself to death in our country, not in Vietnam, not in Tibet, not in the Middle East during the Arab Spring, but in Australia. Now, and the Australian government's refused entry to his parents to attend the funeral because of the lack of paperwork. This is where we are. This is our country now." Meanwhile, in 2013, the same year, the man who burned himself to death arrived in Darwin, our government gave Sri Lanka 2 patrol boats that Malcolm's already mentioned, so that the military could stop people fleeing the country, which was referred to, in weasel words, as stopping the problem at its source. And recently the Sri Lankan government thanked Australia for refusing to co-sponsor a UN bill to establish a war crimes investigation into human rights abuses towards the end of the Civil War. That's something to be proud of, isn't it? In one of the most punitive measures, and this is the concluding remarks, in the most punitive measures in the budget, the government removed the core funding from the Refugee Council of Australia. The Council is an advocate for the rights of refugees and a leading critic of refugee policy in this country. It was a sum of $140,000. Let's measure this against the $245 million to put chaplains into secular schools. Let's measure it against the $12 billion spent on 58 military aircraft and a further $12 billion on their maintenance. In the scheme of the budget, the sum that they've taken away from the Refugee Council is nothing. This is about punishment. This is about silencing an effective critic of government policy. What sort of a country are we? Thank you.